Behind the ancient walls of Windsor Great Park, hidden among towering oaks and rolling meadows, stands a mansion that most people will never see. Its cream-colored stones catch the morning light. Its gardens stretch toward the horizon, and its gates remain forever closed to the world outside. This is Royal Lodge, one of the most expensive and controversial homes in all of England. A £30 million estate where scandal, secrecy, and royal pride have collided in ways that still echo through the corridors of power. But this is not simply a story about a beautiful house. It is a story about a prince who once stood at the heart of British royalty, a man who flew helicopters in the Falklands War, who walked beside queens and presidents, who seemed destined for greatness. And it is a story about how one friendship, one scandal, and one stubborn refusal to let go brought everything crashing down. To understand how Royal Lodge became the most expensive problem in the British monarchy, we must first understand the man who refuses to leave it. Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, the second son of Queen Elizabeth II, a prince who had everything and lost nearly all of it. The golden child of Windsor. Prince Andrew Albert Christian Edward was born on the 19th of February 1960 inside Buckingham Palace itself. He entered the world as the first child born to a reigning British monarch in over a century. From his very first breath, he was special. The newspapers called him the Golden Boy. The public adored him, and his mother, Queen Elizabeth, who had been forced to spend so much time away from her older children, Charles and Anne, due to royal duties, lavished attention on her new baby. Growing up, Andrew was known as mischievous, charming, and utterly confident. While his older brother Charles was serious and bookish, Andrew was bold and adventurous. He loved sports, practical jokes, and being the center of attention. Palace staff would later recall how he could charm anyone in the room, switching on a smile that made people feel like the most important person in the world. He had a gift for connection, for making people feel seen and valued. But that same confidence sometimes crossed into arrogance. There were whispers even then, quiet comments from palace insiders about a young prince who expected the world to bend to his wishes. A boy who never heard the word no. Servants learned to accommodate his demands without question. Tutors found him difficult to discipline, and the queen, perhaps blinded by maternal love, saw only her darling youngest son. As Andrew grew into a young man, he chose a path that seemed to prove all his admirers right. He joined the Royal Navy and trained as a helicopter pilot. The training was grueling, the standards exacting, but Andrew threw himself into the challenge with characteristic determination. He wanted to be more than just a prince in uniform. He wanted to be a warrior. When the Falklands War erupted in 1982, he got his chance. Andrew flew Sea King helicopters into combat, serving as a decoy for deadly Exocet missiles. These missions were genuinely dangerous. The Argentinian missiles had already sunk British ships. Men had died. And there was Andrew, a prince of the realm, putting his life on the line alongside ordinary sailors. He returned home a genuine war hero, the press snapping photographs as he stepped off HMS Invincible with a rose between his teeth. The gesture was theatrical, perhaps even cocky, but the nation loved it. The Golden Boy had become a golden man. The second son had proven himself worthy of the crown he would never wear. In those years, Andrew dated some of the most beautiful women in the world. Actresses, models, and socialites competed for his attention. The tabloids nicknamed him Randy Andy, following his every romantic move with breathless fascination. He was handsome, royal, and seemed utterly untouchable. Every door opened for him, Every party welcomed him. The future stretched before him like an endless red carpet. And then he met Sarah Ferguson, a love story in the palace. Sarah Ferguson was unlike anyone Andrew had dated before. She was not polished or careful. She was loud, fun-loving, and refreshingly real. The daughter of Major Ronald Ferguson, she had known the royal family since childhood, but had never lost her common touch. Her laugh could fill a room. Her warmth could melt the iciest royal protocol. When she and Andrew reconnected at a party in 1985, the spark between them was immediate. They shared the same boisterous energy, the same appetite for adventure, the same disregard for stuffy tradition. Friends noticed how they finished each other's sentences, how they dissolved into giggles at private jokes, how they seemed genuinely, deeply happy together. Their courtship captured the world's imagination. Here was a prince and a commoner falling genuinely in love. Their wedding in July 1986 at Westminster Abbey drew a global audience of 500 million viewers. The dress was magnificent, the crowds enormous, and Sarah, now the Duchess of York, seemed to breathe new life into the stiff traditions of the monarchy. She was playful where other royals were formal. She laughed at herself when others remained composed. The public loved her. The couple had two daughters, Princess Beatrice in 1988 and Princess Eugenie in 1990. For a brief, shining moment, the Duke and Duchess of York seemed like the future of a modern monarchy. Glamorous, relatable in love. Photographers captured them skiing in Switzerland, vacationing on yachts, playing with their daughters on green lawns. It looked like paradise. But behind the palace walls, cracks were already forming. Andrew's naval career kept him away for months at a time. Sarah, left alone in the rigid world of royal protocol, grew restless. The same spontaneity that charmed the public irritated the palace establishment. She spent too much money. She laughed too loudly. She didn't follow the invisible rules that governed royal behavior. Whispers of tension, then arguments, then something far worse began to circulate. Photographs emerged of Sarah on vacation with another man, receiving a toe kiss that scandalized the nation. The fairy tale was ending in the most public way imaginable. By 1992, the marriage was over. Their separation was announced in March, followed by divorce in 1996. The tabloids feasted on every detail. Sarah became a figure of mockery, her weight criticized, her spending mocked, her judgment questioned endlessly. And yet, something strange happened. Unlike other divorced couples who go their separate ways, Andrew and Sarah remained remarkably close, inseparable even. They continued to attend events together. They raised their daughters as a unified team. They spoke of each other with genuine affection. When Sarah's own home, Remenda Park, burned in 2008, she moved back in with Andrew. Not to a separate wing, not as a temporary guest. She moved into Royal Lodge and never left. They shared meals, raised their daughters together, and presented a united front to the world. It was, and remains, one of the most unusual living arrangements in royal history. Why did they stay together? Some say it was genuine affection, a friendship deeper than romance. Others whisper about financial convenience, about shared secrets that bind them together in ways outsiders cannot understand. The truth, like so much at Royal Lodge, remains hidden behind those heavy iron gates, the house that refuses to die. But what is this mansion that has become the center of so much controversy? What makes Royal Lodge worth fighting for? To answer that question, we must travel back through centuries of English history. Before there were scandals or princes or bitter family feuds, there was simply the land itself. Rolling hills covered in ancient oaks, deer wandering through morning mist, and the quiet beauty of the English countryside stretching toward the horizon. In the 1600s, this land was known as Watkins House, a simple dairy farm nestled within what would become Windsor Great Park. Cows grazed where guards now patrol. Farmers worked fields that would one day hold swimming pools and tennis courts. There was no grandeur here, only the honest rhythms of rural life. Then came Thomas Sandby in 1750. An artist, architect, and mapmaker, Sandby brought an eye for beauty to the humble farmhouse. Under his guidance, the property began its long transformation from simple dwelling to something more refined. But Sandby's touch was modest compared to what would come next. The year was 1812. England was at war with Napoleon. The future King George IV, then still the Prince of Wales, needed temporary lodging while nearby Cumberland Lodge underwent renovations. So the prince, known for his extravagant tastes and legendary spending, moved into this modest farmhouse. Of course, when royalty moves in, nothing stays modest for long. George summoned John Nash, one of Britain's most celebrated architects, the same visionary who had designed Regent's Park and would later transform Buckingham Palace. Nash looked at the simple farmhouse and saw possibilities. He added charming thatched roofs and elegant verandas. He painted the walls in soft, natural colors that blended with the surrounding countryside. He created what appeared to be a cozy country cottage, but was in truth a luxurious royal retreat disguised in humble clothing. This was the genius of Royal Lodge in its earliest form. It looked simple but felt magnificent. It seemed to belong to the land while secretly belonging to kings. But Nash's creation would not last. When King William IV took the throne in 1830, he was horrified by how much money his predecessor had spent on what he considered frivolous decoration. In an act of royal rage, William ordered most of Nash's design demolished. Only the conservatory survived his wrath. The house was then rebuilt in the Georgian style that defines it today. Tall windows, symmetrical wings, classical proportions. It was elegant, balanced, and built to impress. But even then, Royal Lodge carried a curse that would follow it through the centuries. It always demanded more money, more attention, more care. The Queen Mother's paradise. For decades, Royal Lodge passed through various hands, never quite finding its purpose. Until 1931, when everything changed. That year, King George V gave the estate to his son, Prince Albert, the Duke of York, and his wife Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. They were overjoyed. At last, they had a home of their own, away from the formality of London, where they could raise their two daughters in peace. Those daughters were Princess Elizabeth, who would one day become Queen Elizabeth II, and Princess Margaret. And for them, Royal Lodge was not a symbol of controversy or expense. It was simply home. Working with architect Sir Eric Saville, the Duke and Duchess renovated and expanded the mansion. Elizabeth, the future Queen Mother, poured her heart into the gardens. She planted roses that would bloom for decades. She designed pathways that led to hidden benches overlooking the valley. She filled the grounds with the flowers she loved, creating a private paradise that would sustain her through the darkest years ahead. During the Second World War, when bombs fell on London and the nation trembled, the royal family often retreated to Windsor. Young Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret studied here, played here, rehearsed their first radio speeches here. The sound of their laughter echoed through halls that had known farmers, princes, and architects before them. For the Queen Mother, Royal Lodge became more than a house. It became an anchor. After her husband's early death in 1952, after her daughter ascended to the throne, after the world changed in ways no one could have predicted, she remained here. For 50 years, she called Royal Lodge home, the longest any royal has ever lived within its walls. Under her care, the mansion came alive. The gardens flourished with wildflowers and carefully tended roses. The rooms glowed with warmth and hospitality. Politicians, artists, and close friends gathered for tea parties, picnics, and dinners where laughter filled the halls until late into the night. Her grandchildren, including Prince Andrew, spent magical holidays here. They learned to ride horses across the great park. They played games on the sweeping lawns. They experienced the kind of family warmth that cameras could never capture. For Andrew especially, Royal Lodge became a place of safety, of happy memories, of belonging. Perhaps that is why, decades later, he would fight so desperately to remain. But all things must end. On the 30th of March, 2002, the Queen Mother died peacefully in her sleep at Royal Lodge. She was 101 years old. The nation mourned one of its most beloved figures, and suddenly, the question that no one had wanted to ask could no longer be avoided. What would happen to her beloved home? The £30 million handshake. When the Queen Mother passed away, her possessions were divided among her descendants, but Royal Lodge itself remained property of the Crown Estate, that vast organization that manages billions of pounds in land and buildings for the nation. The mansion could not simply be inherited. It had to be leased, and so began negotiations that would plant the seeds of today's bitter conflict. In 2003, Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, was granted a 75-year lease on Royal Lodge. The terms seemed reasonable at first glance. Andrew paid £1 million up front, plus agreed to spend £7.5 million on renovations and repairs. The house needed extensive work after decades of aging, and the Duke committed to restoring it to its former glory. But hidden within that agreement was a ticking time bomb. The lease would run until 2078. Andrew could live there, essentially, for the rest of his life and beyond. No matter what happened, no matter how circumstances changed, no matter what scandals might erupt. At the time, few questioned the arrangement. Andrew was a working royal, a trusted member of the family, the Queen's favorite son, some whispered. Of course he should have Royal Lodge. Of course he should continue his grandmother's legacy. No one imagined what was coming. The prince who had everything. Throughout the 2000s, Prince Andrew lived a life of extraordinary privilege. He represented the Queen on diplomatic missions around the world. He flew on private jets, stayed in five-star hotels, and mingled with the global elite. His official title was Special Representative for International Trade and Investment, a role that took him to boardrooms and palaces across the globe. He was known for his love of golf, his expensive taste in watches, and his ever-expanding circle of wealthy friends. Some of those friendships raised eyebrows even then. Andrew seemed drawn to billionaires and businessmen, to people who existed in the gray areas between legitimate commerce and something darker. But the public largely gave him the benefit of the doubt. He was a prince, after all. A war hero. The Queen's son. Surely there were good explanations for his associations, for the private planes and luxury holidays that seemed to exceed what even a senior royal could afford. At Royal Lodge, life continued in its own rhythm. Andrew and Sarah, despite their divorce, lived together in domestic harmony. Their daughters grew into young women, attended the best schools, and began their own lives. The mansion required constant maintenance, but money seemed to flow from somewhere. The lights stayed on, the gardens were tended, the dream continued. But across the Atlantic, in the glittering world of New York high society, a very different story was unfolding. A story that would eventually reach all the way to the gates of Royal Lodge and change everything. His name was Jeffrey Epstein, the friendship that destroyed a prince. Jeffrey Epstein was a financier who seemed to have emerged from nowhere to become fabulously wealthy. He lived in one of the largest private homes in Manhattan. He owned a private island in the Caribbean. He counted presidents, professors, and princes among his friends. He was also a predator. For years, Epstein had been trafficking young women and girls, using his wealth and connections to commit unspeakable crimes while evading justice. In 2008, he pleaded guilty to procuring a minor for prostitution and served just 13 months in county jail, a sentence so lenient it sparked outrage even then. But here is the detail that would haunt Prince Andrew forever. Despite Epstein's conviction, despite the known allegations against him, Andrew maintained their friendship. He was photographed walking with Epstein in Central Park in 2010, 2 years after the conviction. He stayed at Epstein's homes. He flew on his private jet. Why would a prince associate with a convicted sex offender? The question would eventually demand an answer. When Epstein was arrested again in July 2019 on federal charges of sex trafficking, the spotlight swung toward everyone in his orbit, and no one was more exposed than Prince Andrew. Virginia Giuffre, one of Epstein's victims, alleged that she had been trafficked to the prince on 3 separate occasions when she was just 17 years old. She described encounters in London, New York, and Epstein's private island. A photograph emerged showing Andrew with his arm around her waist, both of them smiling, taken in London in 2001. Andrew denied everything. He claimed he had no memory of meeting Giuffre. He said the photograph might have been doctored. He offered increasingly implausible explanations for his whereabouts and associations. Then came November 2019, and the interview that would seal his fate. The interview that changed everything. Prince Andrew believed he could save himself with words. He agreed to sit down with Emily Maitlis of the BBC's Newsnight program for an unprecedented interview. No royal had ever submitted to such questioning about such serious allegations. What followed was one of the most catastrophic television appearances in modern history. Andrew appeared stiff, uncomfortable, and utterly unaware of how his words would land. When asked about his friendship with Epstein, he said he stayed at his homes because it was convenient. When asked about the allegations against him, he offered bizarre explanations. He claimed he could not have danced with Virginia Giuffre in a nightclub because he suffered from a medical condition that prevented him from sweating. He said he was at a Pizza Express restaurant with his daughter on the night in question. The British public watched in disbelief. This was not a man expressing remorse or sympathy for victims. This was a man focused entirely on his own defense, offering excuses that strained credulity beyond breaking point. Within days, the backlash was overwhelming. Charities distanced themselves from him. Businesses fled from their associations with the Duke. The palace announced that Andrew was stepping back from royal duties indefinitely. For the first time in his life, Prince Andrew was truly alone, and as his world collapsed, one thing remained: Royal Lodge. The £30 million mansion where he had grown up, where he had rebuilt his life after divorce, where he now retreated from a world that no longer wanted him. He would not leave, no matter the cost. No matter the pressure, no matter how loudly his own brother, the new King Charles III, demanded that he go. The siege had begun, a mansion in decline. Walk past the gates of Royal Lodge today, if you could get close enough, and you would see something troubling. The cream-colored walls that once gleamed in the morning light now show cracks running down their length. The paint peels in places. The grand entrance feels less like a welcome and more like a memory. Inside, according to those who have seen it, the situation is worse. Black mold creeps along the corners of rooms that once hosted royalty. Ceilings show signs of water damage from roofs that leak during every heavy rain. The wood rots in places, the stone crumbles in others, and engineers who have inspected the property describe its condition as shocking. To maintain Royal Lodge properly would cost £4 to £5 million every single year. That is the price of preserving a mansion of this size and age. The roofs alone require constant attention. The plumbing dates back decades. The electrical systems need complete rewiring. The gardens demand an army of workers to keep them from returning to wilderness. And yet, somehow, the lights stay on. The staff are paid. The gates remain guarded by security that costs the British taxpayer £3 million annually. Money flows into Royal Lodge from somewhere, though no one outside the palace walls can say exactly where. This is the mystery that haunts the British public. How does a disgraced prince, stripped of his royal income, maintain one of the most expensive private residences in England? Where does the money come from? Some point to the sale of Sunninghill Park, Andrew's former home, which was purchased in 2007 by a Kazakh billionaire for £3 million above the asking price. Others suggest that Queen Elizabeth herself may have quietly supported her favorite son from her private accounts before her death. Whatever the truth, the question refuses to go away. And as the mansion continues to decay, as the costs continue to mount, the pressure on Prince Andrew grows more intense with each passing month. From his windows, if he cares to look, he can see Windsor Castle just 3 miles away. The home of his brother, King Charles III, the man who wants him gone. But Andrew remains, stubborn, defiant, clinging to the last piece of his old life like a man holding on to a sinking ship. The question is not whether the ship will sink. The question is how much longer it can stay afloat, and what will be left when it finally goes under. When we left Prince Andrew, he had retreated behind the gates of Royal Lodge, a disgraced prince hiding from a world that no longer wanted him. The Newsnight interview had destroyed his reputation. His royal duties had been stripped away. His charities had abandoned him. And yet, he remained in his £30 million mansion, defiant, stubborn, refusing to accept that his golden life had turned to ash. But the worst was still to come. The lawsuit that shook the palace. In August of 2021, Virginia Giuffre filed a civil lawsuit against Prince Andrew in a New York federal court. The allegations were devastating. She claimed that Andrew had sexually assaulted her on 3 separate occasions when she was just 17 years old, a minor under American law. She sought unspecified damages and, perhaps more importantly, accountability. The filing sent shockwaves through Buckingham Palace. This was not a tabloid allegation that could be dismissed with a carefully worded statement. This was a legal case in an American court, subject to American rules of discovery, American depositions, and American transparency. Prince Andrew would have to answer questions under oath. His private communications could be subpoenaed. His movements, his associations, his entire life could be laid bare before a jury. Andrew's lawyers fought the case with every tool available. They argued that the lawsuit should be dismissed on technical grounds. They claimed that a previous settlement Giuffre had signed with Jeffrey Epstein protected Andrew from litigation. They questioned the validity of documents, the jurisdiction of the court, the very foundation of her claims. But the judge was not persuaded. In January of 2022, the court ruled that the case could proceed. Prince Andrew would face the prospect of giving testimony under oath, of having his denials tested in a courtroom, of watching his private life dissected before the world. The palace was terrified. The thought of a senior royal being cross-examined about sexual assault allegations was unthinkable. The damage to the institution would be catastrophic. Something had to be done. And so, in February of 2022, just weeks before depositions were scheduled to begin, an announcement shocked the world. Prince Andrew had reached an out-of-court settlement with Virginia Giuffre. The terms were confidential, but reports suggested the payment was somewhere between 12 and 16 million pounds. Andrew made no admission of guilt. The statement released by his lawyers emphasized that he had never intended to malign Giuffre's character, and that he recognized she had suffered as a victim of abuse. It was carefully worded, legally precise, and satisfied no one. For Giuffre, it was a form of justice, though not the public reckoning she had sought. For Andrew, it was supposed to be the end of the nightmare. He had paid the price. He had closed the chapter. Now surely he could begin to rebuild. But there was one problem. Where had the money come from? The Queen's final gift. Queen Elizabeth II had watched her favorite sons fall with a mixture of heartbreak and horror. She had stood by him longer than most mothers would have. She had allowed him to continue living at Royal Lodge. She had reportedly helped fund his legal defense. And when the settlement was announced, whispers immediately began that the Queen herself had provided the money. Estimates of her personal fortune varied, but it was believed to be in the hundreds of millions of pounds. She had the means to help her son escape his legal nightmare. In the months that followed, the Queen's health began to decline. She had already lost her husband, Prince Philip, in April of 2021. Now, in her 96th year, the weight of decades on the throne was finally catching up with her. On the 8th of September, 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died peacefully at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. The nation mourned. The world paid tribute to the longest reigning monarch in British history. And Prince Andrew, whatever his sins, lost the one person who had always protected him. With his mother gone, the dynamics of the royal family shifted overnight. Prince Charles became King Charles III, and the new king had very different ideas about his younger brother's future. A king's fury. The relationship between Charles and Andrew had never been warm. They were opposites in almost every way. Charles was thoughtful, intellectual, devoted to causes like environmentalism and architecture. Andrew was flashy, materialistic, drawn to the company of billionaires and businessmen. Where Charles worried about appearances and duty, Andrew seemed to care only about himself. Even in childhood, the differences were apparent. Charles, the heir to the throne, bore the weight of expectation from his earliest years. He was groomed for kingship, trained in duty, constantly reminded of his responsibilities. Andrew, as the spare, enjoyed far more freedom. He could make mistakes without threatening the succession. He could pursue pleasures without carrying the burden of the crown. This created resentment that festered over decades. Charles sometimes felt that Andrew was spoiled, given too much leeway by their mother. Andrew sometimes felt that Charles was distant, disapproving, unable to appreciate anyone who didn't share his serious outlook on life. Their rivalry was never public, but it was always present. For years, these differences had simmered beneath the surface. But now, with Charles wearing the crown, they erupted into open conflict. The new king made his intentions clear almost immediately. He wanted a slimmed-down monarchy, a smaller group of working royals who would represent the institution with dignity and purpose. There was no place in that vision for Prince Andrew. More than that, there was no place for the ongoing embarrassment of Royal Lodge. Charles saw the mansion as a symbol of everything wrong with his brother's situation. A disgraced prince living in taxpayer-subsidized luxury, while the rest of the nation struggled with rising costs and economic uncertainty. Every headline about Royal Lodge's decaying splendor or mysterious finances was a headline that damaged the monarchy. The king wanted Andrew out. He offered alternatives. Frogmore Cottage, the former home of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, was suggested as a suitable replacement. It was smaller, less expensive to maintain, and far less visible. Andrew could live there quietly, out of the spotlight, causing no further embarrassment. But Andrew refused. His 75-year lease gave him the legal right to remain at Royal Lodge until 2078. No amount of royal pressure could change that. He had paid for renovations. He had maintained the property, however imperfectly. The contract was binding. There was something else, too. Something that went beyond legal rights and property disputes. Royal Lodge was not just a house to Andrew. It was his grandmother's home. It was where the Queen Mother had lived for 50 years, where she had tended her gardens and hosted her famous parties. It was where Andrew had spent childhood holidays, where he had felt loved and valued, where he had been treated not as a problem or an embarrassment, but as a cherished grandson. To leave Royal Lodge would be to sever that connection, to abandon the one place where the ghost of happier times still lingered. Andrew was not just fighting for a building. He was fighting for his past, for his identity, for the last piece of evidence that he had once been someone who mattered. And so began what palace insiders would call the Siege of Royal Lodge. A standoff between two brothers, one wearing a crown, the other clinging to a crumbling mansion. The legal maze. The king's advisors explored every option. They examined the lease agreement line by line, searching for loopholes, for clauses that might allow them to force Andrew's departure. What they found was frustrating. The lease required Andrew to maintain the property in good condition. If he failed to do so, the Crown Estate could theoretically reclaim it. But proving that the property had fallen below acceptable standards would require inspections, legal proceedings, and potentially years of court battles. It would be ugly, public, and exactly the kind of attention the monarchy wanted to avoid. There were other approaches. The king could cut off Andrew's financial support entirely, forcing him to choose between maintaining Royal Lodge and maintaining his lifestyle. But this too carried risks. Andrew might sell stories to the press. He might make public statements that embarrassed the family. He knew secrets, and desperate people do desperate things. Some advisors suggested a buyout, offering Andrew a substantial sum to surrender his lease and move elsewhere. But the optics of paying millions to a disgraced prince were terrible. The public would be furious. The tabloids would feast on the story for months. Every path led to problems. Every solution created new complications. And all the while, Andrew remained behind his gates, waiting, watching, refusing to yield. The irony was bitter. The very privileges that had allowed Andrew to obtain such a favorable lease in the first place now protected him from the consequences of his disgrace. He had been given the 75-year agreement, precisely because he was a senior royal, trusted and respected. Now that trust was gone, but the legal document remained. The monarchy had created a trap for itself, and Andrew was taking full advantage. Palace sources leaked their frustration to sympathetic journalists. Stories appeared suggesting that the king was losing patience, that dramatic action might be imminent, that Andrew's days at Royal Lodge were numbered. But months passed, and nothing changed. The mansion remained occupied. The standoff continued. The Corgi's gambit. In the midst of this standoff, Andrew made a move that some saw as sentimental and others saw as strategic. After Queen Elizabeth's death, he became the caretaker of her two beloved corgis, Muke and Sandy. The corgis had been constant companions to the Queen in her final years. They had walked beside her at Balmoral, slept near her bed, and brought her comfort in moments of loneliness. Now they lived at Royal Lodge, wandering the same gardens where their owner had once strolled. For Andrew, the corgis served multiple purposes. They connected him to his mother's memory. They provided companionship in his increasingly isolated existence. And, perhaps most importantly, they made evicting him even more complicated. Removing Andrew from Royal Lodge would mean uprooting the late Queen's dogs, taking them from the only home they had known since her death. It was a small thing, perhaps, but in a nation of animal lovers, it mattered. The image of bereaved corgis being torn from their home added an emotional dimension that worked in Andrew's favor. Whether this was calculated or coincidental, only Andrew himself could say. But the corgis became part of the story, another thread in the complex tapestry of Royal Lodge. A house divided. For Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, the situation was agonizing. They loved their father despite everything. They had grown up at Royal Lodge, learned to ride there, celebrated holidays there. The mansion held their childhood memories, their family history, their sense of belonging. At the same time, they understood the damage their father had done to himself and to the institution their grandmother had devoted her life to serving. They navigated a world where their surname opened doors and closed them simultaneously. Every job interview, every public appearance, every friendship was shadowed by the question of their father's disgrace. They tried to maintain neutrality, supporting Andrew privately while building their own lives publicly. Beatrice married Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi and had a daughter. Eugenie married Jack Brooksbank and became a mother as well. They represented the family at events, smiled for cameras, and did their best to show that the next generation could move forward. But the Royal Lodge situation hung over everything. As long as their father remained in the mansion, as long as the standoff with King Charles continued, they could not fully escape the shadow of scandal. The mansion that refuses to heal. While the family fought, the house continued to decay. Reports emerged describing walls with cracks wide enough to cause alarm. Black mold spread through rooms that had once glowed with the Queen Mother's hospitality. The swimming pool sat empty for long stretches. The tennis courts showed signs of neglect. The gardens, though still tended, had lost the meticulous perfection of earlier decades. Engineers who inspected the property used words like concerning and significant deterioration. They estimated that bringing Royal Lodge back to its former glory would require tens of millions of pounds, perhaps more than the mansion was even worth. And yet, basic maintenance continued. The lights stayed on. The security guards remained at their posts. Someone was paying the bills, even if no one could say exactly who or how. This mystery only added to public frustration. In a country facing a cost of living crisis, where ordinary families struggled to heat their homes and put food on their tables, The sight of a disgraced prince clinging to a decaying palace seemed almost obscene. Newspapers ran calculations showing how many nurses' salaries could be paid with the money spent on Andrew's security alone. Social media filled with angry comments demanding accountability. Opinion polls showed that a majority of Britons wanted Andrew removed from Royal Lodge. They saw no reason why he should enjoy such privilege, after bringing such shame upon himself and his family. Even traditionally, royalist voters expressed discomfort with the situation. The monarchy had survived for centuries by maintaining at least the appearance of serving the nation. Andrew's entrenched position at Royal Lodge undermined that carefully cultivated image. Members of Parliament raised questions. Journalists filed freedom of information requests. Activists staged protests near the estate's entrance. The pressure came from every direction, relentless and unceasing. But public opinion, however fierce, could not override a legally binding lease. And so the standoff continued. The weight of isolation. What is life like inside Royal Lodge today? Reports paint a picture of profound isolation. Andrew rarely leaves the grounds. When he does venture out, it is usually for quiet walks with the corgis or occasional visits to Windsor Castle for family events. He no longer attends public functions. He no longer represents the crown abroad. He no longer meets with charities or hosts dinners for visiting dignitaries. The world that once revolved around him has moved on, leaving him behind. Sarah Ferguson remains by his side, a constant presence in an otherwise empty existence. She continues to write books, make media appearances, and maintain her own public profile. She speaks of forgiveness and resilience, of the importance of family, of moving forward despite adversity. Their relationship, whatever its precise nature, has proven remarkably durable. Nearly 3 decades after their divorce, they still choose to live together. They still defend each other in public. They still present a united front against a world that has judged them both harshly, though for very different reasons. Some observers find this touching, evidence of a bond that transcends the legal categories of marriage and divorce. Others find it strange, perhaps even enabling, as if their mutual support allows each of them to avoid fully confronting their mistakes. Whatever the truth, Sarah has stood by Andrew through the darkest chapter of his life. That loyalty, whatever its motivations, cannot be entirely dismissed. Together, they occupy the 30-room mansion like ghosts haunting their own past. The halls that once echoed with laughter and conversation now sit mostly silent. The bedrooms designed for guests remain empty. The dining room, built for grand dinners, hosts only the 2 of them and occasionally their daughters. It is, by any measure, a strange and melancholy existence. A man who once had everything, reduced to pacing the corridors of a crumbling house, waiting for something that may never come. The symbolic wait. Royal Lodge has become more than just a building. It is now a symbol, and symbols carry meanings beyond their physical form. For those who support the monarchy, it represents a problem that refuses to go away. Every story about Andrew's mansion is a story that distracts from the good work done by other royals. Every photograph of peeling paint or overgrown gardens undermines the image of royal responsibility and dignity. For critics of the monarchy, Royal Lodge proves their point. Here is privilege without accountability, wealth without purpose, tradition without relevance. If a disgraced prince can hold an entire institution hostage from his crumbling estate, what does that say about the system itself? For Andrew himself, Royal Lodge may represent the last piece of his identity. He was once a prince, a war hero, a charming figure at the center of global attention. All of that is gone now. But as long as he remains in his grandmother's house, surrounded by memories of happier times, he can perhaps pretend that he is still the man he used to be. And for the British people, Royal Lodge has become a test of whether their nation truly believes in equality before the law, or whether some people remain above the consequences that ordinary citizens would face. A test of whether tradition and contracts can protect the powerful from accountability. A test of patience that grows shorter with each passing year. The future unknown. How will this story end? No one can say for certain. Perhaps King Charles will eventually find a way to pressure his brother into leaving. Perhaps Andrew's finances will collapse, making the mansion impossible to maintain. Perhaps some new scandal will emerge, forcing a resolution that neither side currently imagines. Perhaps the property will deteriorate so badly that it becomes uninhabitable, solving the problem through sheer decay. There are also darker possibilities. Andrew's health could fail. The stress of isolation and public disgrace takes its toll on any person. Or perhaps some unexpected twist of fate will intervene, some development that no one has yet imagined. What seems certain is that this standoff cannot last forever. Time moves forward. Circumstances change. Buildings crumble. People grow old. Eventually, one way or another, the siege of Royal Lodge will end. Or perhaps nothing will change. Perhaps Andrew will remain at Royal Lodge for decades more, growing old behind those iron gates, walking those familiar paths, clinging to the last fragment of a shattered dream. The lease runs until 2078. Andrew is currently in his mid-60s. The math suggests he could, theoretically, live out his entire life within those walls, surrounded by his memories, his regrets, and the quiet accusation of a house that demands more than he can give. The final reflection. Stand at the edge of Windsor Great Park on a clear evening, and you can see Royal Lodge in the distance. Its towers catch the fading light. Its windows reflect the setting sun. From afar, it still looks magnificent, a cream-colored dream rising from the English countryside. But look closer, and the cracks appear. The peeling paint, the sagging gardens, the sense of something beautiful slowly surrendering to time. This is a house that has seen too much, survived too much, and now bears the weight of one man's disgrace upon its ancient walls. In many ways, that is Prince Andrew's story. A golden child who grew into a golden man, only to watch everything he built crumble around him. A prince who had every advantage, every opportunity, every door held open for him, and somehow still managed to destroy it all. Royal Lodge stands as a monument to that destruction. Not the destruction of a building, though that too may come eventually, but the destruction of a life, a reputation, a legacy. It is a £30 million reminder that privilege does not protect you from your own choices, that titles cannot shield you from consequences, that even palaces can become prisons. The scandal did not destroy the house. The scandal destroyed the man who lived in it. And now he wanders its halls alone, a prince without a purpose, waiting for an ending that may never bring peace. The gates remain closed. The guards still patrol. The corgis still wander the gardens where a queen once walked. And inside, in the quiet of the evening, Prince Andrew faces the truth that no amount of money or marble can hide. Some things once broken cannot be repaired. Some falls have no recovery. Some stories end not with redemption, but with a man sitting alone in a beautiful room, wondering how it all went so terribly wrong. That is the tragedy of Royal Lodge. That is the story of Prince Andrew, and that is the burden he will carry until the very end. The golden child who became a war hero. The war hero who became a scandal. The scandal that became an exile. The exile who refused to leave his grandmother's house, even as it crumbled around him. History will remember Prince Andrew not for his service in the Falklands, not for his years representing the crown, not for any contribution to his country or his family. History will remember him for this, for the friendship that destroyed him, for the interview that damned him, for the mansion he clung to while the world moved on. And Royal Lodge itself will endure, as it has for centuries. Long after Andrew is gone, long after the current scandals are forgotten, the house will remain. Perhaps restored to its former glory by future generations. Perhaps open to the public as a museum of royal history. Perhaps simply standing, silent and patient, waiting for the next chapter of its endless story. Because houses, unlike people, do not carry shame. They do not suffer disgrace. They simply exist, holding within their walls the memories of everyone who lived and loved and failed within them. Royal Lodge has seen farmers and kings, architects and queens. It has witnessed joy and sorrow, triumph and tragedy. It will witness more, long after Prince Andrew has taken his secrets to the grave. That is the true lesson of this story. Not about one man's fall, but about the endurance of stone and the fragility of reputation. Not about scandal, but about time. Time heals. Time forgets. Time moves on. But some wounds never fully close, and some stories never truly end.